Salam, you're watching People's Dispatch, and this is the daily debrief coming to you from our studios here in New Delhi. I'm Siddhantani, and we're talking today on the show about why farmers in the western Indian state of Maharashtra are on the march again after their demands have not been implemented by the state government despite repeated assurances. We also celebrate the life of actor, singer, and activist Harry Belafonte, who had a profound impact on millions of people around the world. And finally, a conference has been held in Colombia where several countries have participated uh, in a discussion on how to figure out a way out of the ongoing political crisis in Venezuela.
This very important march, which will march for 3 days, more than 60 kilometers, to the office of the Revenue Minister of Maharashtra, Mr. Radha Krishna Vikhe Patil. This march is being organized because even in the last month march, whatever demands had been conceded by the government, nothing much is seen regarding the implementation of those things. And therefore, on the contrary, on some matters, things have got even worse.
Our first story of the day comes from, like I was saying, the Indian state of Maharashtra, which is one of the largest and most industrialized in the country. Farmers there have resumed their long march under the banner of the All India Kisan Sabha, starting in Akole in Ahmednagar on Wednesday. The protest movement resumes after a 38-day gap, during which the state government failed to implement earlier demands that were agreed on, after which the march was suspended. Apart from the support that the farmers are asking for from the government in terms of pricing and procurement of their products, and this includes a wide variety of farmers, those who are growing food crops, cash crops, as well as dairy farmers. They have also demanded an end to police persecution of those who are protesting against land acquisition by the state for various projects, including an interstate expressway as well as an oil refinery. Farmers say that once again the state has broken its promises and they will now march to the very last drop of blood in their bodies. This very strong statement highlights the plight that a vast majority of farmers in what remains a predominantly agrarian India face even today. Pragya, we were hoping to have with us today on the show one of the leaders of the present farm agitation, but unfortunately we have to make do with you.
You will have to.
But thanks for joining us in studio. Tell us, after a bit of a break, why are farmers in Maharashtra on the march again? And how is this a story that goes beyond the state, which is one of the largest provinces in India, of course, and kind of represents what farmers throughout India and even other parts of the world are currently facing?
Sanat, I'll try to compensate for not being there by having spoken to some people who are there very close to the developments. So this movement isn't actually new. In 2017, the farmers of Maharashtra, which is a larger state, which is also a very heavily industrialized state, started doing this program called the Long March under the AIKS banner. So the reason for it is actually like they're related to the industrialization of the state. Land is always a tussle. It's a matter which farmers fight over and the corporates always have their eyes on it. Who the state favors is actually a deciding factor on how strong the movement will be. The second factor is that these farmers are Adivasis, indigenous people. They're not wealthy. So the government, whether at the center or in the state, finds it easier to ignore them because they don't own much land. In 2004, the Indian government at that time, a different regime from the one we have today, had commissioned a report, a series of reports. The last report, which came out in 2006, basically laid out, what the government should do to make growth of the economy more equitable. And one of the things that report said was that the land, the forest land included, should be shared with the indigenous people. The Adivasis should not only get access to the produce, but be able to use that and own that land. And that is, it's over 2 decades and people are still fighting. Remember that the law to give Adivasis the access to land and ownership of land has been passed, but the struggle precedes that, right from India's independence. So that is an unfulfilled promise, and it's very crucial to the farmers that also the policies and programs which help develop, say, electricity or commercialize electricity should not end up overburdening them when input costs are anyway rising. So those are the kind of issues that this particular march has been raising In March, these farmers had protested.
Mm.
They'd walked several hundred kilometers, and they were promised that their demands would be met. But they weren't, so they had no choice but to get back on the streets.
Is this sort of present set of demands an expansion of the scope, or is it, like you were mentioning, just sort of continuing to struggle for aspects that farmers have been battling, like you mentioned, from independence onwards?
Yeah, it's both actually. The reasons why the farmers are able to protest is because, somebody is organizing them, putting them together, and providing the resources to make such a movement possible.
Right.
But their demands would actually resonate with any farmer in India. When the commission, which I just mentioned, came out with its report, one of its observations was that 3% of the land in India is owned by 50% of the population, and the top 10 in terms of income, the top 10 percentage of Indian population owns 54% of the land. That was the situation in the 90s, and arguably there have been reports which said that the situation has worsened.
Sure.
Yes, so if you have very little land, then you depend, if you're a dairy farmer, you depend on a larger dairy to buy your milk, and then the consumer is buying it at a higher price. The farmer observes this.
Right.
If the farmer is told that, develop cash crop, they need more water. And again, the same commission report 2 decades ago had said that, look, you need to be able to provide water. This Indian governments haven't done. The Maharashtra farmers are simply reflecting an angst which everywhere in the country the farmers do feel.
Absolutely. Thanks very much, Pragya, for that. And I guess we'll ask you to sort of keep an eye on things as they proceed and come back to you for more updates later on. Harry Belafonte, the singer, actor, activist, and bankroller to decades of civil rights actions and outspoken critic of the United States' imperialist foreign policy, has died aged 96. Belafonte came from a working-class family. He spent his younger years working odd jobs, including some time in the US Navy during the Second World War. This is, of course, a navy that was at the time still segregated and where black soldiers were limited largely to jobs like cooks and loaders. Belafonte got into acting after watching plays at the American Negro Theatre alongside the likes of Sidney Poitier. He learned the craft with the likes of Marlon Brando and Walter Matthau and performed with Miles Davis and Charlie Parker, and of course later on in his career with Miriam Makeba. His initiatives outside of the performing arts arena raised millions of dollars to fight AIDS and famine, and his music, of course, touched millions around the world. Professor and artist herself, Sumangla Damodaran, joins us via video conference now for more on Harry Belafonte and the kind of impact and lasting legacy that he had. Thank you very much for joining us today, Sumangla, to talk about Harry Belafonte, someone who is, of course, like we were saying, touched millions of people all around the world, not just with his music and his acting bits, but also the kind of activism that he's known for, and he spent his life practicing. In that context, and I'd like to start with something a little bit personal, if possible, Sumangla. What are your sort of memories of Harry Belafonte's music, as well as the message that came with it for people, who are oppressed around the world?
Yeah. Well, personally, of course, like millions and millions of people all over the world, Harry Belafonte has been one real major beacon of inspiration in terms of his music, and not just what he sang, but also how he sang it. The performativity itself has been such an important thing as far as Belafonte is concerned. And for me, if you ask me about favorite songs and so on, it's actually difficult to say. But one of my favorites is Come Back Liza, Come Back Girl, Wipe the Tear From Me Eye. Usually people would talk about Jamaica, Farewell, or Day-O, the banana song. Which also is fantastic. And then, there's so much. There's such a fantastic repertoire there in terms of, what he sang through his life. But for me, Come Back Liza somehow touched me deeply ever since I heard it, which must have been about 40 years ago or so. And what was fascinating is that, in my mind, the newspapers are writing about him as an African American singer. But somehow the American part was never part of the imagination. I think in this part of the world, somehow we always associated Harry Belafonte with the Caribbean.
Absolutely.
Not just because of Jamaica Farewell, but also the fact that he exposed a lot of people in many generations to the idea of Caribbean music to some extent. Of course, that was not without controversy, because I do know that people of Indian origin, those who came from indentured backgrounds, were quite critical of the way in which Belafonte portrayed the idea of Caribbean music, where it was as if only the Afro-Caribbean as if only Afro-Caribbean history mattered, and it was so there is that politics and all of that which has to be recognized, and I think has to be understood as well. But the very fact that that Caribbean music of the kind that he sang established a certain kind of politics internationally as well. So a little removed from, I would say, what one would consider standard African American rhetoric of identity.
Right. He also very quickly emerged as one of the highest paid sort of artists, and therefore, and then went on to use that wealth to bankroll Sumangla movements, projects, programs, not just, of course, in the United States, but around the world, focusing also on Africa and things like that. And in that sense, providing a sort of an idea, a role model, or an inspiration to artists who also had an activist part to them. And this is something that also you connect with probably at a personal level very deeply. What is the kind of, in that sense, I hesitate to use the word, but I'm using it anyway, legacy that Harry Belafonte leaves behind?
Well, he was actually working with a legacy himself. And that legacy is of a fantastic kind of internationalism. And the internationalism in the best sense of the word. Carrying on a tradition which perhaps began from the early 20th century onwards, with the rise of the union movement and the civil rights movement and anti-colonial struggles and all of that, by the 50s, 60s, and the 70s, someone like Belafonte was actually signaling an internationalism in a very significant kind of way. So, for example, his apart from the large sums of money that he donated for various democratic causes, but also, for example, initiating the cultural boycott of South Africa, or playing a very major role in the cultural boycott of South Africa. His album with Miriam Makeba, which again went on to become very famous, which was bringing in a certain live connection with Africa, and it's not only a remembered connection in terms of the legacy of slavery and so on, but actually in terms of an active intervention into the lives of Africans in the contemporary. So that's what I mean in terms of the best kind of internationalism, and he played a huge role in that. And he did it also through the music, and he did it in this utterly joyful way, which I think was remarkable. So if one actually watches his performances with Miriam Makeba, that joy comes through. And often not understanding each other in terms of language, except through English, but still the connections that were being established through their voices and the way in which. So, I mean, he was singing a lot of the stuff that came from a Caribbean, history. Whereas someone like Miriam Makeba was actually singing a lot of stuff that came from Southern Africa and other parts of Africa, which were very much in the present at that particular point of time. So just to watch them work together, for me as an artist, that's been performatively very, very interesting, I think.
All right. Thank you very much for taking us back and allowing us to actually feel some of that joy today, Sumangla. We're moving on with that to our final story of the day, which is actually, we're talking about Venezuela, a country that Harry Belafonte himself visited, when he went to meet Hugo Chavez and spoke quite famously about George W. Bush, calling him at that time the biggest tyrant and the biggest terrorist in the world for his actions. Thank you again, Sumangla. So Colombia is playing host to a multinational conference involving 19 nations as well as the European Union in order to help chart a way out of the ongoing political crisis in neighboring Venezuela. Host and President of Colombia, Gustavo Petro, the first leftist leader of his country, has been instrumental in resuming diplomatic relations between the two states and is now looking to further that conversation in order to reintegrate Venezuela into the regional as well as the world economies after a long period of exclusion as well as hardship, largely as a result of Western imposed sanctions and the ever present hand of the United States. Prashant is in studio now and we'll talk a bit more. Prashant, that Bogota is hosting these talks is significant itself. Also, 19 countries and the European Union participating. What are we hoping to see at the end of these discussions, which, like Gustavo Petro was saying, can either take take the region in the direction of peace and democracy, or further sort of entrench conflict.
Right, Siddhant. So, I mean, the discussions concluded. We're waiting for some of the more detailed documents. Maybe they'll have some more details. But very important to look at the context in which these discussions are taking place. First of all, the fact is that the Venezuelan government, the legitimate government led by Nicolas Maduro, and the opposition were having discussions. It started in 2021. They came to a halt more or less they came to a halt some months ago, also because the fact that the decisions have not really been implemented. The decision was to use some of the frozen assets of the Venezuelan government abroad and set up some kind of a humanitarian aid fund. That has been delayed. And from reports, it does look like the main reason is the United States, because their delays are what is causing it. So there is a sense of that process being stuck at one level. There's an attempt to sort of bring back that process. So while the Bogota meeting did not have either the Venezuelan government or the opposition participating, this was mainly a meeting of international players to kind of look at some of these issues. Fundamentally, the issue will remain the question of sanctions and frozen assets. And that is what the Venezuelan government has said time and again. Now, if you look at media reports, if you look at the claims by the opposition, claims by the United States, there's this whole issue of demanding that there be elections on time and all that, as though the Venezuelan government is not conducting elections. Now, important to remember that Venezuela has conducted a lot of elections in recent times. Their fairness has been testified by international observers. Every time elections are held, teams from across the world, including, for instance, a team associated with Jimmy Carter, the former president of the United States, all of them have come. They have said that the elections are as fair as you would see in most parts of the world. In fact, fairer than in many other parts of the world which call themselves democracies, for instance. So there is a very regular process of elections. There's another round scheduled. Presidential elections are scheduled next year. And that there's nothing to indicate that those will not be held or anything of that sort. So there is already a clear procedure that takes place on these elections. These elections are marked by a lot of participation by the people. So what the government and the opposition have been doing in their talks is to try to find a way to sort of expand the ambit of people who can participate. We must remember that this opposition has a very problematic record. It basically denied the legitimacy of the elections, which brought Maduro to power for a second time. It denied the legitimacy of the parliamentary elections. It claimed itself the parliament, although a fresh parliamentary election had been held. But nonetheless, there's been an attempt to kind of heal some of the wounds that years of these divisions have caused by having this negotiation process. And that's a very welcome thing. And but it's also important to remember that these wounds have also been caused because of international interference. Absolutely. The fact that the United States has imposed sanctions which have led to tens of thousands of deaths. There are reports which chronicle the impact of these sanctions. The fact that assets belonging to the Venezuelan people abroad have been seized, whether it be in the UK, whether it be in the US, whether it be the US. The fact that let's say Alex Saab, who's a Venezuelan diplomat who was trying to arrange humanitarian supplies, he was detained and is in arrest in the United States. All these are very, thorny issues as far as Venezuela is concerned. It has raised it. So the key question will be that in addition to proclamations, because the United States was also there at this meeting, European countries were also there, they're all in some way, they're all parties to the conflict. While they're taking a high moral ground and calling for democracy and all that, they are parties which have caused suffering to the Venezuelan people. So I think a key question will be whether this agreement on delivering aid, this mechanism that was agreed upon, will be delivered whether the sanctions will be withdrawn, whether the assets will start to be unfrozen. These are all very important questions, and the answers to that will determine the future of this process.
The sanctions, like you rightly mentioned, are key, of course, Prashant. But another issue is that of Juan Guaido, who was recently in Colombia and took many of the headlines for what is being called an expulsion from there. But what was he doing in Colombia to begin with, and what is the sort of real story behind the headlines?
So just to give our viewers an idea of who Juan Guaido is, he's become an internet meme right now, a bit of a joke. Every time there's a political crisis in a country, people say, is Juan Guaido going to be the president of that country? Because that is what his so-called presidency was. Yeah. He just declared himself the president without any legitimacy whatsoever. The scary thing is that despite this completely fraudulent declaration of being the president, he was widely supported. He was considered the legitimate president of Venezuela by many countries in Europe and North America. And this gave him a lot of power to sabotage the lives of the people of Venezuela. That's a very important issue. Now, over the years, what has happened is he's lost more and more credibility. He's been associated with many corruption scandals. Finally, his own former allies, the opposition, basically ousted him, said that he had no longer any legitimacy, even within their dissent, to be the leader. So he's basically right now completely cut off, pretty much seems to be just an agent of the US stirring up trouble. And it's important to note that on this incident you're talking about, he went from Venezuela to claim that he had somehow bypassed security, government persecution, whatever. Important to remember that there's no arrest warrant out for him in Venezuela. But he came to Colombia, he said, and then he claimed that he had been expelled from Colombia. Now the Colombians clarified that he had a ticket to the US and he was being escorted by US by US agents. So it is not that he was arrested by the Colombians and thrown out of the country. So this was just definitely a very desperate, almost pathetic attempt to sort of try to maintain relevance. And like you said, it served to actually capture a lot of the headlines because that became the news. Guaido is in Colombia, although he at this point has really no say whatsoever in the political situation. He's not a player, but this was definitely an attempt by him, and in fact probably by his backers in the US as well, to sort of create a bit more of chaos in this space at that moment, which is very delicate right now, because so many of these issues, like I said earlier, have come to the fore, and they demand structural solutions in which the US has to play a part. So Guaido definitely sort of continuing his streak of being a spoiler. At least now you can probably argue, like I said, that it's more of nuisance value. It's more of it's somewhere borders between a joke and a farce, whatever. But at some point, his actions were costing lives, and that's very important to remember. Yeah. So he'll never probably face accountability for any of that. But the fact remains that he'll go down in history as one of those people.
All right. Thanks very much for that update, Prashant. That's all we have on this episode of the Daily Debrief. As always, we invite you to head to our website, peoplesdispatch.org, for more details on these stories and all of the other work we do. Don't also forget to give us a follow on the social media platform of your choice for regular updates on videos, articles, and all of the rest. You can also get in touch there and give us your feedback and comments on this show, of course, but also the other shows as well as the articles that we publish. We'll be back tomorrow, same time, same place. Until then, I hope you stay safe. Goodbye.